Alrighty, good morning or good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from. Happy Friday. It is Friday, January the 22nd, 2021. Welcome to the Visto Show. I'm very happy to be joined by Richard Berman. Rich, thanks very much for coming on the show today.
Morning or afternoon or evening, depending where in the world you are.
It's quite an interesting 2020. Quite remains to be an interesting 2021. All this online stuff going on. So, anyways, really happy to dive into it. Really excited with this episode. Rich, can you really quickly tell the viewers, the listeners, the watchers, just a little bit more about who you are?
Sure. So I'm Richard, and I run a public relations and marketing agency. I founded it in San Francisco almost 20 years ago, and moved to Toronto about 3 years ago to open up an office here. And in the process of doing that, I had to apply for permanent resident status. So I have, in the last few years, gone through the entire odyssey, if you want to call it that, of applying and getting the paperwork together and all of that. And so, uh, what's interesting is I actually grew up in the States, but went to university here in Canada. So I came to Canada on a student visa, switched over to permanent resident status, and then I ended up leaving Canada for almost 25 years. My permanent resident status expired because I had never gotten citizenship, which means that a few years ago, when I decided to move here, I had to start the entire process over from the very beginning.
Absolutely. And that's one of the big reasons why we wanted to have you on is to talk about the experience coming first as an international student, then as a PR. And then, of course, I'm going to fill out the rest of your bio that you forgot, which is you are the co-founder, one of the co-founders of Visto. And so I thought it would be really interesting to talk about your immigration story, also talk a little bit about how you and I met and how we got the company started and you know what the vision is that we're working on right now. But let's talk immigration stuff first. And the other thing I'll say is we are live on Facebook and YouTube. I see we have some people tuned in. If you do have any questions for Richard about him or his journey or immigration, feel free to throw them in the chat, especially the ones that are on topic. We'll definitely be throwing them at Richard live and getting his input. So, Rich, let's start at the beginning. Can you take us back to when you applied to come to Canada as an international student? Why was it that you wanted to come to Canada, considering you were living in the US? And what was the process like of actually going through the immigration part?
Sure. So, growing up in the States, I had never really considered going to Canada for university. And when I was in high school, and in the States, a lot of the universities send recruiters to the different high schools to basically meet with the top students and try to convince them to come to their school. And so I probably met with 15 or 20 recruiters that would come to our school. And someone was there from the University of Toronto, and we
Hmm.
started talking. And one thing led to another, and I ended up getting a scholarship to the University of Toronto. And free sounded like a pretty good price point to me. And so
Especially in
I
Canadian dollars.
Right, yeah, free in Canada is even better than free in the U.S. Yeah, I moved to Toronto when I was 17 and started university and fell in love with Toronto. This is my favorite city in the world, and I've lived a lot of different places. I've lived in 11 different cities around the world, and this is the only one I've ever lived in twice.
Hmm. And can you take us through? Do you remember much of the visa process with regards to the study permit?
Yeah, so getting a student visa was really, really easy, in the sense that once I had my acceptance from the university as an international student, I then had to go to the Canadian consulate in Washington, D.C. in person. Fortunately, I actually grew up about 5 kilometers from Washington, D.C. I was born in Washington, D.C., grew up in the suburbs. So it was pretty easy for me to go to the Canadian consulate and take care of it in person. But you can also do it by mail, it just takes longer. This was a long time ago, and I know things have changed. I'm very, very old.
Yeah, now
Uh,
you can do it online. Just for those that are curious, you can apply online.
yeah, exactly. And so we did the paperwork, and then it came back, and then I had to get a medical form filled out before I came to Canada. I had to have a statement of having a certain amount of assets, financial assets, but uh, it was pretty quick. It took a couple of months after I was accepted, and I got the note in the mail, and My dad drove me to Toronto, which is about 11 hours from my hometown. And when we crossed the border, we handed it to them. Most people fly if they're coming from other places, and showed it to the guy at the border, and he stamped it, and I was on a student visa.
Awesome. Yeah, the study permit application, relatively straightforward for those who need some help. Definitely check out our free portal at visto.ai. We have a complete guide to the study permit. Now, Rich, what would you tell those people who right now are considering coming to Canada, or maybe, deciding between different countries, Canada, the US, UK, Australia, or some of the, popular destinations? If you could tell something to someone who's in another country they're thinking of, or maybe they've already applied, what would you tell them? Are they making a good choice, or maybe also some words of how to prepare for that move? Especially at that age, that can be a big move for a lot of people.
Yeah, so there's a few things about moving to Canada, and I know I'm talking about Toronto, but obviously, allegedly, there's other parts of Canada besides. I've seen them on a map, so I know they exist. No, so a few things about Canada. One is um, Canadians love paperwork. And I have done, just since I opened my Toronto office here 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, I have done more paperwork in 2.5 years than I have in the previous 15 running my company in the States. Tax stuff, employee stuff, everything in Canada is very by the book. The US has a tendency to be a little bit more casual, perhaps. I've also lived in the UK, also very much more casual. Canada is very process driven, and I think that's when people ask me the major difference between Canadians and Americans. Canadians like to follow rules,
Right.
and so I would say that anything that you're doing, if you're thinking about moving to Canada, there's a process for it. Do not deviate from that process because it'll just make things harder. And I really want to stress that.
Hmm.
I lived in Eastern Europe. I've lived, as I mentioned, the UK, certainly the States. Uh, Canada is the most rigid when it comes to paperwork. Not saying it's more difficult to get in,
Hmm.
but if there's a comma missing on a document, the Canadian government will notice it.
Yeah, and pros and cons too, right? The cons, a lot of paperwork. The pros are people are generally treated properly if you follow the process, right? There are these systems in place for a reason. So that's good to hear. And again, if anyone needs help with those applications, definitely check out our free portal. So, Rich, let's talk a little bit about PR, right? You go as a student. I'm assuming you enjoyed it, and then for whatever reason, if you want to go into some detail, you decided to go back to the US. Eventually, you and your family decided to come back to Canada. What was that PR process like? I know you and I have talked about it at length, but it's very interesting and I think important for a lot of people to hear, especially when we start talking about the company itself. So would love for you
Right.
to explain that.
Yeah. So I made the decision in early 2017. My family and I decided to move to Toronto, and we had a timetable of moving here in 2018. So we wanted to give ourselves about a year and a half. So the first thing that we did was really looked at a lot of the business laws just to make sure that my paperwork would be okay for me to run my business legally in Canada. And that took a while, but it wasn't really a difficult process. Um, we then came to Toronto for a couple of months just to scope out neighborhoods where we wanted to buy a house, schools for my kids. We have a lot of friends here because I did live here for about 8 or 9 years back in the when I was a student and then afterwards. So I have a lot of friends here. So we looked at neighborhoods where we wanted to be, kind of things we wanted to do. We spent about 2 months here, just as visitors, really just figuring out what we wanted to do. Once I started the application process, um, the paperwork is there. And I went to an immigration lawyer, and we got a checklist of all the stuff that I needed: criminal background checks, family photos. Just there's a list. And the problem was, and this is kind of what led to ultimately Josh and I having a conversation, is it took me 5 or 6 months to get the paperwork together because whatever I sent my lawyer wasn't good enough. We need pictures of family photos. So I would send them. Oh, they need to be 300 DPI. Well, that wasn't in the original list.
Hmm.
And then we need to get a criminal background check from every state you've lived in the last 20 years. So I've lived in 3 different states in the last 20 years. and then I sent it in. Oh, we also need a federal one. And so it was sort of like whatever I sent in wasn't good enough. And so every piece of paper took 3 different attempts to get it right.
Hmm.
And a lot of that, I think, with my lawyer wasn't particularly clear on what the expectations were. But also, even in the documentation from the Canadian government, it doesn't necessarily specify that. So by the time I got the papers together, I started in January, putting the paperwork together in January of 2017, or sorry, January of 2018. And it probably wasn't until June that we actually submitted my immigration packet.
Right. And then how long was the processing for PR for spousal sponsorship? Typically, I think around a year.
So my wife is a Canadian citizen. So my wife is originally from South Africa. Her family had actually immigrated to Canada in the late 80s. And so she's a Canadian citizen. So even with being married to a Canadian, I still had to go through the same process as everybody else, the same paperwork. There are no shortcuts. I was hoping there would be shortcuts, but there weren't. So I submitted it in June and got my official paperwork in December. It was about 6 months.
Oh wow. Okay, that's
It was
pretty
pretty,
good. I mean,
well, it was
the shortcut is that U.S. citizens typically, processing time is probably on the quicker end. Is that's what we would call the shortcut in this sense.
yeah, I know people, I know a lot of people. And one thing about Toronto, 51% of the people who live in Toronto's about, the whole metropolitan area is about 5 million people. 51% were not born in Canada.
Oh wow.
This is a city of immigrants. I mean, really, the block that I live on is like the United Nations. I mean, there are people from Uzbekistan, there's people from India, there's people from the US, there's people from the Ukraine, Germany. I mean, just my one block probably has people from 20 different countries. You'll find that all over Toronto. It's a very, very multicultural, multi-ethnic city.
Hmm.
There are ethnic pockets. So, there's certain areas like Brampton is kind of known as being an Indian area, but there are plenty of South Asians all over the entire city.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah, and Brampton actually now has a large Mexican area. So, it doesn't stay the same. And, as you'll see in any city, people who come from a certain place will tend to congregate for a while, but
Hmm.
then eventually there's kind of a spread that happens. So, but I know people even coming from India, it took them 6, 7 months. There's really no way to predict how long it's going to take once the paperwork is in. But what's really important is if you get rejected because of a paperwork issue, it just adds months and months to it. So you could be completely qualified and, oh, your criminal background check didn't have the fingerprints that you need from the police. So you have to go back and do that. And that adds 1, 2 months, no problem.
Oh
So
yeah.
you have to make sure that whatever you submit is perfect. Because if it's not perfect, the Canadian government will notice. It's all done out of an office in Nova Scotia, Sydney, Nova Scotia. I can't tell you how many things I sent to a PO box in Sydney, Nova Scotia. Um, and funny enough story about Sydney, Nova Scotia is every couple of years, some European tourist will be on their honeymoon going to Sydney, Australia, and they'll get the wrong plane ticket and they'll accidentally show up in Nova Scotia. And every
What a
couple of years,
surprise.
yeah, it makes the national news in Canada. This Italian couple got on the wrong plane and ended up in Nova Scotia. And then they end up having a great time because the locals kind of adopt them. And it happens often enough that people are kind of used to it. But Sydney,
Yeah.
Nova Scotia is way out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It's like, a 4-hour flight from Toronto to even get there. But the Canadian government has put offices all over in a lot of smaller areas to kind of boost the local economy. So you won't be dealing with Ottawa or Toronto. You'll be dealing with Sydney, Nova Scotia. Anyway, so I did all this paperwork and I just kept thinking, this is the most backwards process. Why isn't there an app for this? Like, why isn't there a technology platform that allows me to collect and upload the documents and have a checklist? And so I started building one and I just started working on a tool that ultimately is what led to me meeting Josh.
Awesome. And we're definitely going to get into that. I have one more question more on the immigration side. And if anybody is tuning in live and wants to ask a question to Rich, feel free to throw it in the comments. Rich, before we get into kind of the tech company side of the discussion, what are 1 or 2 pieces of advice you would give to someone who is either considering immigrating to Canada or maybe they've been approved and they're waiting to travel here? Maybe like 1 or 2 tips that would make the move or the immigration process a little bit easier since you've been through it twice now.
Yeah. So the first thing is you need a Canadian bank account to do anything. And, I had my Citibank account in the US for 25 years. When I moved back to Toronto, I didn't have a bank account and I went to Royal Bank to open an account. And it took a while. It took me like a month to do everything. So Canadian banks are also very, very by the book. And so as early as you can start the process of opening an account at a Canadian bank, it makes life a lot easier when you get here. Um, Buy a good winter coat. Um, Canada is a cold country, and Toronto isn't particularly cold by Canadian standards. But um, I was talking to a friend of mine who's from Uganda, and I asked him what was his first winter like, and he said, "I thought I was going to die." And he went from 35 degrees to Celsius to minus 10 Celsius, and he had never experienced that before. And you can definitely buy them here. There are places. There's a store called MEC Mountain Equipment Co-op. Just spend the money, spend the $300, buy the good winter coat. It's going to be worth it.
Absolutely. That's very good advice. So let's go back to the tech side. So you go through this process. It's a pain in the ass for a wide variety of reasons. You start thinking that there's going to be a better way. I mean, I still actually remember our first phone call. Not to make this kind of like a hoo-ha romantic discussion, but I still remember our first phone call. We were introduced by a mutual connection who knew that we were both kind of thinking, working on ideas in the immigration tech space. But I'd be interested to hear from your perspective, how were you kind of approaching the problem at that time? And then if you can take us through, how we met, I think some of the listeners, especially the Visto users, might be interested in hearing how this company came to be between the two of us.
Sure. So I started working on this document tool, and the idea that I had created was a way where your immigration lawyer would give you a checklist. It was a tool that lawyers would use. If they had a prospective client who was looking to apply, they would send them a link, and it would be a secure upload where a photo of your passport, a photo of your driver's license. And what you would do is, as the prospective immigrant, you would send in the thing, whatever the item was that was requested, and then the lawyer would look at it, and if it met their standards, they would say yes. So it was a double check. So I have uploaded X, and then the lawyer would say, yes, you have uploaded it correctly. Or they would come back and say, yeah, your photograph on your driver's license is grainy, it's going to get rejected. Or, the bottom is cut off of your birth certificate, so that's going to raise issues. You have to rescan it. And once it was approved, they would do it, and then it would go into a file. And when you were ready to apply, you would upload the entire digital file. So that's what I had started working on. So there's a big tech conference here called Collision. It was canceled last year because of COVID. It went to an online only conference. It's just gone online only again this year. I'm really disappointed by that. It's a great conference. I was really, really into it. And it had actually been in the States for a number of years. They moved it to Toronto 2 years ago. So Josh and I were both at the conference independently. We had never met each other. And one of the things in there was a legal tech innovation zone. And I ended up meeting all these people who were doing legal tech things. And I thought, oh, I could work with them. So I ended up meeting this guy there. And I started telling him what I was working on. He said, about an hour ago, I met this other guy, and he's an immigration lawyer, and he's working on something. You guys should talk. So he put me in touch with Josh because he had met both of us at this conference. So neither of us really know this guy. Literally, it's just a guy we met at a conference and got his card, and he connected the two of us. And all of a sudden, we start talking, and there seemed to be some real synergies. And that's kind of where this all started. Now, I will say, Josh had already done a bunch of stuff on it, and I've sort of been in an advisory role with Josh. So Josh is the CEO. I don't want to take credit for work I didn't do. Josh has really built this company, but I was in on the very early days, helping with deciding what the tech infrastructure was going to be, building and bringing in some of our early developers, certainly helping with some of the marketing, certainly helping with some of the business development, things like that. So I'm actively involved with the company, but really, Josh has taken it and run with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to hear, Rich, and you've definitely been an integral part, especially on the marketing, the PR side, which, really important for a wide variety of reasons. Rich, can you talk a little bit about, immigration and kind of where you see it going, right? I mean, you and I over the last year and a half, longer now since starting the company, I mean, we talk about this all the time, but maybe for the listeners and viewers, talk a little bit about, what our thought process is and where we kind of see things going in the future, why it's so important that we think tech and innovate and immigration should be converging a little bit quicker than it was before we started.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's there's a lot of different angles to that question. People have written books about that, but basically, so Canada is a really underpopulated country. If you look at a map or a globe, you'll see Canada is enormous. It's the second largest country in the world. There's like 6 people who live here. I mean, the entire population of Canada, is what, 35 million, not even 35 million. It's a pretty small country, population-wise. And almost, if you look at it, over half of Canadians live in Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver. I think like 60-70% of Canadians live within an hour of those 3 cities. So
I think I read another stat too that a crazy high percentage, like 70 or 80%, live within like an hour drive of the border, right? Just because of the temperatures. Yeah.
Yeah, if you get into northern Canada, it's really cold, and they're really the only major cities that are truly north. I mean, Edmonton is pretty far north. Montreal is pretty far north, although it's not that far from the U.S. border. Montreal to the U.S. border is less than an hour to Vermont. So it's an interesting country, and there's a lot of tech innovation, a very highly educated population, but there aren't enough skilled workers in Canada to meet the need. And I think the Canadian government identified a gap of about 200,000 skilled tech workers. So literally, Canada is actively trying to bring in immigrants who are skilled. And skilled immigrants are people with computer science and engineering degrees, work experience, who want to work in tech. So bank IT, all the banks are really short-staffed in their IT departments. There's a lot of different things, right? So there are real opportunities here. So before I moved to Toronto, I lived in the Bay Area. So Silicon Valley was my backyard for almost 20 years. And I know when people think tech innovation, they think of the Bay Area. There's a lot going on in the Bay Area. There's a few reasons why I think Canada, if I were someone looking in my 20s, looking to go to North America to work, I would really look very seriously at Toronto before I looked at Silicon Valley. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there's a thing called express entry. It's a visa that gets you into Canada for skilled workers. It can get you a very quick path to citizenship. If you look at the US, the main visa that people come in on is called an H-1B. An H-1B visa is tied to a particular employer, meaning that if you come to the States and you're working for Google in Silicon Valley, if you get laid off, if you, your division changes, whatever happens, your visa ends. So you can be in the States for 15 years on an H-1B. Your company goes out of business. You lose your job. There's downsizing. You have to be out of the country in, 60 days or something. It's a really quick turnaround. So everyone I know who's on an H-1B is constantly worried about their immigration status. In Canada, you can show up day one with permanent residence as an express entry and not worry about that.
Without a job as well.
Yeah, and the thing is, in the US, to get an H-1B, a company has to sponsor you. So you have to have a job lined up even before you apply for your visa, unless you enter the visa lottery, which is a totally different thing, but that's really not tied to skill. So you end up, the visa options for Canada are much better. So my day job, I run a marketing agency that works with a lot of tech companies. So I work with a lot of tech employees from all over the world, Mexico, India, China. And what's interesting is a lot of people from those countries really want to work abroad. There's a lot of financial reasons for it, obviously, but also the social capital and the prestige. Oh, I worked in England for 3 years. I worked in Canada. I worked in Silicon Valley. There's a social currency that comes with that. In fact, I saw a survey a few years ago of Indian tech workers, and the number one thing that they valued in the job was not title or salary or responsibility. It was the ability to work abroad. And I saw that and I'm thinking, it's interesting because I know so many, when I was living in California, I knew so many people from China, India, Pakistan, Iran, who were living in the States who had come as immigrants. and to work. And for them, it was really important for them, in terms of when they go back to India, when they go back to Pakistan, if they go back, they have that credibility and that prestige. A lot of them, of course, want to stay. And that's kind of where the H-1B visa falls flat in the US. Then you mix into the fact that the US has been, I'm just going to be really blunt, the last 4 years in the US have been insane. And I'll say that as an American living in Canada, I felt like an astronaut watching the Earth burn from space. Watching the US was crazy. And frankly, the US got very unfriendly to immigrants. And you had a lot of cases where, there was a case in Kansas where a guy went into a bar and shot two guys who were Indian because he was angry at immigrants, right? You had people being, putting up walls. You had, a policy which just got reversed, banning people from predominantly Muslim countries from visiting the US. So the last 4 years have not been a good look for the US on the immigration front. I think things will change now, but I think it's going to take a while to undo that reputational damage. The other thing that's happening is Silicon Valley, if you've read, Elon Musk has moved his headquarters to Texas. Oracle is moving its headquarters to Texas. Some of that has to do with California state taxes. But the main thing is it's very hard to hire talent in the Bay Area. And the wages are extremely high. Yeah, I mean, a starting engineer salary in the Bay Area is crazy. As a result, people are getting 6 or 7 job offers and companies just can't fill their coffers. And that's why companies like Google have opened centers of excellence in Ontario. There's a place called Waterloo. It's best known for the University of Waterloo, which has a great engineering school. So Google literally opened a campus in Waterloo just to hire Waterloo grads to come work for Google in Waterloo. What's happening now because of COVID is a lot of companies are moving to remote models. So companies like Shopify that were based in Ottawa and Toronto, hiring hundreds of people locally, are no longer doing that. They've announced that they're going to stay remote permanently. So what you're seeing is a lot of tech workers in Canada leaving Toronto and moving to rural areas. So, my friend Baljeet, she and her husband just sold their house in Toronto and bought a farm about 2 hours away because they can both work remote. Mm-hmm. Why would they stay in not small, they had a nice house, but why would they stay in a house in Toronto when they can have 20 acres out, in a farm and grow produce and all that kind of stuff? So the options for moving to Canada, the visa options are a lot better. The employment options are great. So everyone is hiring here. I mean, there's such a shortfall. Every tech company I know is hiring, but it's not just tech companies, it's banks, it's insurance companies, financial services companies, it's government. So there are IT jobs, there are network management jobs all over the place. And they are those jobs are open and people are having a lot of trouble filling them, which is why Canada has rolled out the welcome mat. Canada literally has said, we want 200,000 skilled immigrants to come into Canada.
Just for tech alone, yeah. And the recent update in November where they said that they're basically upping the quota for PRs that they want to accept every year. Over the last 3 years, the targets were in the 300,000 range, and they've upped those numbers now to over 400,000 permanent residents per year, with a majority of that being in the skilled worker department. So absolutely, very well said, Rich. I have one more question for you. Again, if any viewers want to ask Rich a question, feel free to throw it in the chat. My last question to you, Rich, is where do you see this space going in the next 5 years in Canada? What do you think we're going to see in the immigration tech scene, maybe how they overlap or how they don't?
Well, I think they completely overlap. I think that right now Canada is about 35 million people. I would say that probably within 15 years, we will be at 45 million people. And almost all of that will be fueled by immigration. It's interesting. People talk about the American melting pot, and there's very definitely an American identity. And there's this very thing like, if you're in the States, be American. People who come from other countries are sort of encouraged to take on an American persona. Canada is a really different culture than that. As an example, I have a friend who's Greek Canadian. He was born in Canada. He's third generation. His parents were born in Canada. His first language is Greek. You would never see that in the States. Like, you might see that in Latino communities where people are living in an area where it's 90% Spanish speaking. But in general, in Canada, you'll meet third and fourth generation who still have a very strong cultural, ethnic, linguistic tie to their family's country of origin. And you'll see it in sports loyalties, and it's kind of interesting, right? You meet someone who's third generation Canadian, grandparents are from England, they're huge Arsenal supporters. You know, you meet someone from India, huge into the Chennai Super Kings in cricket, even though they were born in Canada, and maybe their parents were born in Canada. So there is much more of a tie culturally. Indian Canadians that I know, they go back and visit Canada, you know, they go to visit India 2 or 3 times a year. Most of my friends in the States who are Indian, they'd go back every couple of years. But I would say culturally, there's a much bigger tie.
Mm-hmm.
There's obviously an enormous tech scene in India. You have Bangalore, you have Pune, you have Hyderabad. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between Indian companies and Canadian companies. So that there are a lot of opportunities for work that are binational.
Absolutely. And you alluded to it earlier, the diversity we see in Toronto. I grew up in Ottawa, so I'm based out of Toronto. I totally agree. I see it all the time. I also grew up in Ottawa, which was extremely diverse as well. Government town, capital, et cetera, et cetera. So there's definitely a lot more of that, even beyond Toronto. Rich, this has been really great. We really appreciate you coming on, sharing a little bit more about your story, talking a little bit more of the company. If people are more interested in getting in touch or learning more about your marketing services or anything like that, where do you recommend they go?
Sure. Well, if you're looking to come to Canada, you should go to www.visto.ai. Had to do the plug there.
Of course.
And then my company is called Verb Factory. So VERB Factory. So www.verbfactory.com. And we do marketing primarily for technology companies. So working with Josh is really great because we get to, it's 2 things I'm really passionate about, which is immigration because of my own experience, and also technology because of my professional experience. So it's been a lot of fun working with Josh for the last, I don't know, how long has it been? A year and a half, maybe?
You're in a little over a year and a half now by my math. Yeah.
Yeah,
Time flies.
it does. It sure does. And we've gone through a lot of different things with the company to get it to where it is today. And it's really exciting. And, you know, I can just say this as someone who's moved to Canada twice and who's lived in a lot of different places. It's a great country to live in. It's a great country for me as an entrepreneur to build a business. There's a great talent, and I like the culture here. And I'm really happy to be working with Josh, obviously, and on a bigger level, happy to be in Canada.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Rich, for coming on. We appreciate it. Thanks for everybody who tuned in live or if you're watching after the fact. Again, if you're interested in Canada, even if you're at the beginning, you want to learn more about the different options, study permit, PR, work permit, definitely check out the free platform, visto.ai, visto.ai. We will also link to Richard's link in the description if you need that as well. Rich, thanks again for coming on. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.